Okay, I'm going to start the introductions now. I think we can still see people logging in, but hopefully everyone will have joined us by the end of that. So hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Laura. I work with Helena at Local Futures. There is so far about 74 of you in the chat, so hopefully a few more of you will be joining shortly. Before we begin, I just need to carry out a few admin tasks. So I just want to check, hopefully by now everyone can hear me. If a few of you could just put in the chat box and say yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. You are all automatically on mute to avoid any background noise during the webinar. Dependent on time, we are going to have some live questions at the end, as well as reading out some questions that have been put in the chat box. So as the webinar is going on, please feel free to put any questions or responses into the chat box and I can read them out, or there'll be an opportunity for you to raise your hand if you want to join in the conversation, and then you can speak with Helena and Rupert then. You will all be emailed the recording and the chat transcript in either this afternoon or tomorrow, and it will also be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. And I know that some of you may not be able to stay for the full hour and a half, so I just wanted to share with you the next steps on from this webinar, which is joining the International Alliance for Localization. It was set up by Helena's organisation, Local Futures, and we now have over 900 members in 58 different countries. And it's a cross-cultural network of thinkers and activists and anyone interested in localising and wanting to connect with others doing so around the world. It's a perfect place to carry on the discussion after this webinar. You can sign up very easily on the Local Futures website, and I'll pop a link to that in the chat box. We've recently launched a very exciting project that I'm hoping some of you may want to get involved with. So it's called the Voices from the IAL video project, and the end result is to create a compilation of 2-minute videos from International Alliance for Localization members. So that could be me or you, and people all around the world, basically using their phones or their laptops and recording them just for 2 minutes. It can be shorter if you want, explaining what local means to you and why it's so important. So I'm hoping maybe after this webinar, some of you are full of inspiration and feel like recording that, and you can then share it on our Facebook page and listserv. And another very exciting project that we have coming up is World Localization Day, which will be taking place on June the 21st. You're going to be hearing a lot more about this from Local Futures. I know a lot of you are already signed up to our emails, so keep an eye on your inbox because we'll be discussing it there, and also on our social media accounts as well. I think Helena will say a little bit more about that at the end of the webinar. So now I will hand over to Helena, and we're very excited to have Rupert Read joining us today. And they are going to be discussing how mitigating our many crises, from climate change to coronavirus, requires an urgent shift from global to local, away from growth at any cost globalization and towards more diversified, localized economies that serve the real needs for people and the planet.
Thank you, Laura. I'd like to also add, we would really like it if you could put in the chat box where you're from, where you are, maybe the town and the country, because it is very exciting about global community. We are promoting local community as a cornerstone of healthier identities and an absolute necessity for our mental health and for more empowerment at the local level. But the global communities that are building and the global collaboration is essential at the grassroots, and we're going to need it also at the national level. So that would be great if you can do that. And I want to say thanks to Rupert, my friend and colleague. We've been involved in writing projects over the past years. And as you probably know, he's one of the main spokespeople for Extinction Rebellion. He's also a philosopher and the head of a very interesting think tank called the Green.
Former head. I've stepped down.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, very nice that you could join us, Rupert. So
yeah, very, very good to be here this morning.
So I think maybe, since I'm coming with this very broad picture, maybe I'll give a little bit of an overview of where we're at. And, you know, we're focusing tonight on the issue of climate change in particular. But we at Local Futures see climate change as one of the many, many serious effects of a global economic system that is basically out of control. That's what it is. It's out of control because for a long time now, our governments have been deregulating global economic activity, which means removing constraints and visible, accountable, ways of measuring and seeing what's actually going on at the global level. So we see this ignorance about the global economy and its multiple destructive effects as the most important issue facing us. As many of you will have heard now with the pandemic, there's much speculation that it's connected to industrial and for-profit driven treatment of animals and food production. There's also speculation that it could be coming from a virology lab in Wuhan. Whatever the truth is, whatever the cause is, we are talking about this out of sight, irresponsible, unregulated global trade and global speculation as driving up the most inhuman, terrible treatment of animals, as we know, the animal factories, but also in healthcare, the focus has been progressively on how do we find profitable cures without scientific research on health. What is it to be healthy? What do we need to be healthy? When we talk about local in health, we are talking above all about providing people with very, very local precision, which is how can I be more informed about the multitude of things I can do to stay healthy. And there are many herbs and vitamins, there's exercise, there's meditation, there's a whole clear path for how do we stay healthier. But that is not included in the industry that our governments are ending up subsidizing. And right now with the pandemic, being really informed about those things that you can do yourself to stay healthy, very, very important. But it's not just in health. One of the biggest costs of this system is that literally every country we know of, really no exception, this globalizing path has favored the giant corporations and a few billionaires that benefit. And in every single country we know, the gap between rich and poor has visibly and rather obscenely escalated. And I include my native country of Sweden. I include Bhutan, the kingdom where we have worked for several years in local futures. We know of no exception. In addition to this path, this economic path, which has been essentially built because our governments are using all the tools they have to shape the economy, to decide the prices of things in the marketplace, to train our children and our adults at universities, to train them to suit the needs of a global economy instead of a multitude of national, regional, and local economies. The systematic help to aid essentially a financial casino and an out-of-control, invisible hand has been a disaster, also because it is creating mass unemployment. We don't realize how many people in India and China apply for a single job as cleaners. Very often you're talking about thousands of people, and you're talking about thousands of university graduates. You're talking about in virtually every country, the jobs, because of the globalizing economy, the jobs are being concentrated in fewer and fewer megalopolis urban centers. You have the high rise and you have the sprawl, and the end result is that as people crowd into those cities, illness spreads much faster, as we're seeing now with the pandemic, and in those crowded conditions, the ecological footprint for every single person escalates dramatically. Now, you don't see that so clearly in the industrialized world because the infrastructure has already been centralized and things have been built up over a long time. But when you see villages in China and India, Indonesia, and many countries around the world, moving from the smaller town and village into the city, you see how suddenly every pound of food they eat has to be transported longer and longer distances using fossil fuels usually, plastic packaging, mountains of it, and mounting everywhere. And in so many countries, that plastic is burned, like right in the household or right next to it, bathing people in dioxin fumes. Anyway, for multiple reasons, we need to look at the link between the globalizing economy and mega urbanization, and the link between that and a massive increase in the ecological footprint of every single individual. In addition, this global economy is imposing, and I mean through a tyrannical psychological pressure, the idea that to be respectable, to be someone, to be loved, you need to adhere to the fashions, to the right car, to the right look of a consumer culture that's being imposed everywhere. It's a consumer monoculture. Now, that consumer monoculture likes to show some dark-skinned faces, some oriental faces, as this great supermarket of multiculturalism. But in actual fact, just like the food supermarket, this system destroys diversity at its core. And so I got a few more things to say. One of them is that in talking about monoculture, one of the clearest and most important areas to look at is food and farming. It's very difficult to urge people in the Western industrialized world to take food and farming as the most important sector to change, because we're so far removed from it, and we haven't understood that the destruction of healthy farming has been absolutely fundamental to building up a military-industrial complex, a competition and a fear, competition around oil and scarce resources, while it has been used, that oil has been used to decimate the soil, to create monocultures, which we know they're not sustainable. But please now help us to get out the word that in order to shift in agriculture, it's not enough to talk about regenerative. We need to be having a clear, holistic picture which understands that primary, if we're going to use one word, diversity is the important word. And diversity is linked to many markets closer to the farm. In other words, the vision is that most countries should be able to prioritize producing a range of foods for themselves, not producing a single or a few things for export. So for us, in many ways, the enemy is monoculture for export, which when it comes to fishery, food, farming, fishery, and forestry, is an absolute disaster. And that means we're talking about destroying the real economy. Everything we need comes from the earth. And that primary production of what happens on the land, how we do it, is vitally important in rethinking a way forward now. I want to add also finally that one of the biggest costs, in addition to these, to the imposition of monoculture on the land and the other costs I mentioned, is a psychological pressure, particularly on young people, that is not only about looking the right part, which creates in virtually every child a sense of insecurity and inferiority, but simultaneously the pressures in school in virtually every country have been increasing. More and more information is meant to be digested, more and more fear around getting a decent job, a decent livelihood, a decent life. Why? Because the path we've been traveling, particularly in the last 30 years, as we've been given more freedom and more rights to corporations and banks that don't pay tax and have no regulations, that path creates fewer and fewer jobs, and they are concentrated in the big cities. In those big cities, worldwide, the prices of housing have escalated dramatically. So you're finding many people having to drive 3 hours a day to that job, supposedly that good job in the city. And this scarcity of jobs is a completely artificial situation. It's a political choice. Whether we choose to subsidize energy and technology and urbanization and global concentration of fewer and fewer businesses, or we choose in a political way to subsidize, support, and deregulate a growth from the ground up. We want to see more food per acre, which we can only do by diversifying. That is the way to increase productivity. In forestry, diversity, we can have more wood that we can use in a meaningful way as building materials, even sometimes as fuel. But we need diversification. To do that effectively, we need more eyes per acre. We need more people on the land. The blind path of technology, and now reinforced by 5G, the Internet of Things, and robots, is a huge leap in the wrong direction to kill more jobs and impose more monoculture and the blind and stupid machinery that will pick every apple, even though only half of them are ripe, and then often burn the other half. That's the system we have in place already, and it will only get worse if we don't wake up. Now, one of the big effects of all of this is that young people in particular, under so much pressure, worldwide, are suffering from epidemics of anxiety, depression, and epidemics of suicide. And again, we're seeing that from Bhutan and Ladakh in the Himalayas to Sweden, to South Korea, Japan, America, England. It's an epidemic and it's global. We so want people to see that in order to rejoice in the fact they are not to blame. It's not their bad parenting. It's not their government that has been doing the wrong things. This is a bigger issue which actually can be solved much more easily than we think. But we need the bigger picture to see how the pieces fit together and to see why it is that strengthening local economies worldwide, strengthening the real growth of the actual real economy from the ground up, but also the growth in the number of businesses, a growth in the number of jobs, a growth in the number of towns and cities where we can have thriving lives, not just resilient. Resilient is just sort of managing to survive. We see a world where from today till tomorrow, if we wake up to the big picture, focus on systemic economic change to really create that thriving, real economy movement from the ground up, we see the potential for a multitude, a flowering of thriving towns and cities as a potential, even on this crowded planet. And we are so privileged because in having pioneered this localization movement, we've been in touch with countless thousands of initiatives, projects, individuals. We've been in touch with the biggest social movement in the world, Via Campesina, which has 200 million members. And so we know that the problem is not human nature. It's not human greed. It's not that we are so selfish and we don't want change. No, it's that we haven't understood our real political choice, which has to do with economic literacy, linked to ecological literacy. So eco-literacy as a prerequisite for a much healthier way forward. So that's what we're about at Local Futures. And Rupert, I'm so happy that you're here and that we've had this chance to collaborate over the last 3 years or so. Oh, you're muted. Wait.
I'm unmuted. Good.
Okay.
Thanks, Helena. Yeah, so yeah, I'm Rupert Read. I'm here in my study in Norwich, England. I'm a professor at the University of East Anglia, where I teach philosophy. I'm, as has been mentioned, a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. And I'm also, of course, as has been mentioned, someone who has collaborated directly with Helena. And I've been reminded in what you've just been saying, Helena, of the pamphlet we wrote a few years ago called Post-Growth Localization. And I'm just going to put the link to that in the chat because I think that that is more pertinent than ever, really, as a sort of a sequel in a way to your wonderful book, Helena, which is also more pertinent than ever. If anyone is on the call and hasn't read Ancient Futures, then make sure that you put that on your reading list straight after the call. Why do I say that the idea of post-growth localization is more relevant than ever? Well, because localization is more relevant than ever, as Helena has just beautifully outlined. But I want to also focus for a minute on the post-growth part, where we're talking there about no longer seeking endless economic growth. Because, of course, we're seeing something very fascinating and unusual, more or less unprecedented in the world right now today, which is that many economies have been put more or less on pause. The term I like to use for this is protective contraction. We're contracting the economy to protect ourselves and to protect those who are most vulnerable from this coronavirus. And more generally, we are also, many of us, those of us who are not in key industries, pausing ourselves. Many of us are locked down at home. Many of us are not doing our normal jobs at the moment, or if we are doing them, we're doing them at a slower rate. This pause, I think, is a really amazing opportunity. It's a very strange time, the time we're in right now. You might say it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. I spend half my time being incandescent with fury against the terrible governments which have got us into this mess, including my own government, the UK government. Some governments, of course, such as the New Zealand government, have done a lot better, and writing stuff against them and so on. And I spend the other half of my time, to be honest with you, sort of reveling in the fact that I'm not having to rush all over the place as I usually do. And lots of meetings have been cancelled and so on. Extinction Rebellion is sort of on a kind of partial pause itself. A lot of our meetings have been suspended and people are taking the time to really experience this unusual, unique moment. Because they think, and we think, and I think, that if we're able to really tune into this moment and resonate with it, that could change everything. And it must change everything. We must change everything for reasons absolutely implicit in what Helena has already said. And in particular, as and when and if we start to emerge from this protective contraction of the economy, we must reset differently. Extinction Rebellion, as you all know, I'm sure, is concerned that we are right now extinguishing many other species, many other creatures, and we are potentially putting ourselves on the path to extinction ourselves. And certainly we're putting ourselves on the path to societal collapses, ecologically driven and climatically driven societal collapses. After the terrible general election result we had in the UK in December, when the Conservatives were re-elected with a large majority in what was supposed to have been the climate election, but really turned out not to be, I was pretty depressed, to be honest. And I kind of started to think, well, our chances of stopping collapse in a society like this one, at any rate, have taken a further hit and are now so low as to be almost negligible. It seems to me that the coronavirus has given us one last chance to do the kind of things that Helena and I talked about in our pamphlet and that Helena has just outlined to you. I think this is genuinely a last chance saloon. And we have to seize this chance. We have to, as we emerge from this pause, we have to be ready to reset very, very differently. If we do not, then I'm afraid the scenarios that have been sketched by Extinction Rebellion, and of course sketched by climate scientists for a long time now, will come to pass, and we will face ecologically and climatically driven societal collapses around the world. So we have to seize this last chance to build a radically more local future. And I want to just mention for a minute a couple of reasons which have, again, emerged into great clarity because of this pandemic as to why that is so, and why we may have a chance now that we didn't have before, because these things are starting to become comprehended by more people. So let's talk about air travel for a minute. So air travel is absolutely central and focal to the project of economic globalization. And of course, air travel has been absolutely central and focal to the progress of this pandemic. There wouldn't have been a global pandemic like this without air travel. Think back to the last comparable pandemic, which was the Spanish flu a century ago. The Spanish flu basically traveled around the world at the speed of steamships and trains and cars and horses and carts. This pandemic has traveled at the speed of planes, and that's part of the reason why it's been unprecedented and has hit us so hard and has overwhelmed many countries before they were ready for it. And everybody who's got two brain cells to rub together understands this now. Everybody now understands, oh, right, so if we have unrestricted air travel, this is the kind of thing that can result. To go more generally into how economic globalization is at the root of this pandemic, as Helena implied, we have pretty good evidence that the pandemic is a result of ecological destruction in China and terrible treatment of animals there. It may also have been influenced by dangerous climate change. But of course, none of these things are specific to China. It's really important whenever anyone starts to bash China and say, oh, yes, it's all China's fault. It's all China's fault that we've got all these carbon emissions. It's all China's fault that we've got all this coronavirus. It's really important to remember the reason why most of this ecological destruction and so on is happening in China is to give us the products that we demand. And by us, I mean people in countries like the UK and the USA and Australia and so on. And of course, when I talk about the products that we demand, I'd also like to chime in with something that Helena said. Our demanding these products is itself a product. It's a product of advertising. It's a product of the way that the producers and the elites want us to buy this stuff and want us to self-identify as consumers. So ultimately, the very emergence of the coronavirus in the first place can be traced back to the project of economic globalization, the project of GDP growth, the project of the elite trying to enrich themselves and trying to involve all of the rest of us in that system, and the project of air travel, which is integral to that project. And let's be very clear, if we allow economic globalization to continue, then, well, there is very likely, as I've already implied, to be ecologically driven societal collapse before very long. But before that happens, and indeed potentially after that happens as well, there will also be more pandemics, right? We are opening ourselves up systematically to this kind of risk, the more we allow the project of economic globalization to let rip. So let's be very clear, this pandemic was not a black swan event. It was not radically unexpected. My colleague Nassim Taleb, for example, warned several years ago that this kind of thing was very likely if we continue to proceed along the path that we're on. So that's why we need a post-growth localization. Actually, to be more strictly accurate, and we could talk about this, the term which is actually appropriate here, I believe, is glocalization, which is not a very elegant term, but just putting it in the chat box there. It reflects perhaps slightly more accurately what we want to need, because as Helena and I outline in our pamphlet, there are some things which need to be coordinated more at the international level. The World Health Organization is obviously one organization that needs more power and more resources not less. And we discuss some of the other ways in which these things must be globally coordinated in our pamphlet. And I go into this in my little piece called 24 Theses on Corona, which I've just dumped in the chat as well. The fundamental thing we need to do is put fetters on economic globalization, put it into reverse, put the project of growthism into reverse, and create a post-growth local future. But it should also be a global future. It shouldn't just be a retreat from the global. We should carry on, for example, being able to communicate in this wonderful way around the globe as we are doing here this morning. So that's really what I wanted to say to introduce my part of this conversation here this morning. This moment of pause that we have is unique. It is an opportunity that absolutely must not be missed. We must use it to prepare a different kind of reset. If we do not, we are squandering what is, I believe, almost certainly our last chance. And the reason why, the fundamental reason why we really have a chance now, I think, that we didn't have before, is that this pandemic is giving us an experience of shared vulnerability. It's giving us around the world an experience of shared vulnerability, shared openness to mortality, if not for ourselves, then at least for our parents or grandparents, shared emergency. And if we can manage to take that mindset and transfer it to the situation of the climate and ecological emergency, then we will have a power and a force and a momentum that we have never had before. And that is what could enable us, that experience of shared vulnerability and shared emergency. That is what could enable us to fuel let's call it a rebellion against our current system that could move us in the direction that Helena so eloquently expounded earlier. And that, I think, is a real hope that we now have. It's going to be incredibly difficult, but folks, we've got to do it because, as I say, this almost certainly is our last chance at avoiding a societal collapse event and creating the better, more flourishing future that, as Helena said, is potentially available to us now. Helena, what do you reckon?
Well, I would just like to add that in addition to experiencing our vulnerability, this pause has also led to a number of people appreciating a bit of a pause, a bit of a slowing down. There
Absolutely.
are many, many people who are struggling and are very frightened, and it's been, absolutely dreadful for many people. But the slowing down, I mean, I know people who have no idea, where their money is going to come from, but they've said to me that they feel comforted by the fact that everybody's in the same boat and that they too are really enjoying this pause. Another thing that's happened that's vitally important is that there has been a very clear, across the world, demonstration of community building. That
Totally.
in lockdown, groups, self-organizing groups around the world have shown their concern for people who are alone, elderly people, and generally caring for each other. And then the third thing has been this amazing interest in local food. And so there's that, and then also let's not forget that it has led to even the New York Times announcing that they really think that governments are not going to want to continue policies that create such a dependence on the global economy. And then apparently now several countries, including France, are announcing that they don't want to bail out companies that are registered in tax havens. So they're basically saying what is part of this localization agenda, which is to say to businesses, site here to sell here, be part of us, be registered, be regulated by us, and yes, we welcome you. And so also I just want to say that what we're talking about is economic localization. For that, we need global collaboration from the grassroots up. So that's why I don't think actually that I agree with you, Rupert. I know a lot of people would use the term glocalization, which is very ugly, as you said, but I think it confuses the issue because we're saying we need to localize or shift in the direction of localizing economically in order to enable a path of genuine collaboration to protect our environment, to protect basic human rights, and to invest in the sort of institutions that we want to invest in. And that's not economic globalization. That's not allowing a financial casino to dominate.
Yeah, no, totally. Let me be clear. All I mean, let's put it this way, all I mean by localization is that there are some elements that need to be done globally and other elements that need to be done locally. And as you say, the simple way to separate those out is we need a fundamental economic relocalization, whereas we need some elements of political, diplomatic, etc., internationalization and indeed globalization.
And I think one of the reasons why very few people have really understood about localization is because they conflate economic activity, for-profit economic activity, with the need for political collaboration and the clear need for international dialogue and collaboration. And let's not conflate those. That's what we say. Because
totally agree.
Economically, we also need, but economically trade, global trade has always been there, even going back thousands of years. And so localizing is not about saying let's not have any trade. So in that sense, there is a global element, but it's about the actual businesses not functioning as independent, deregulated global entities, but rather being placed there. So it's a little bit complicated.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit more about some of those brass tacks and details, because I couldn't agree more with the remarks you made a couple of minutes ago there, Helena. So something which a lot of people are noticing is they're noticing the value of nature more, and they're simply literally being able to hear birds singing more and things like that. I think an enormous number of people are welcoming the much lower levels of pollution, the much lower levels of car traffic, obviously the much lower levels of air travel. And I, for one, find planes overhead, very, very disturbing to sleep, etc. We're not getting those at the moment, not nearly so many. And a lot of people are feeling, because of these kinds of things, we don't want to go back. And this is a hashtag that Extinction Rebellion are using, no going back. Yeah, there's a whole load of things we don't want to go back on. I could go on. A lot of people are working from home and they want to carry on working from home. They don't want to have to endure this kind of pointless carbon-heavy commute that so many people have to endure. You mentioned food. Of course, food is absolutely critical. It's one of the things which we're understanding now is that in a country like mine, for example, England is completely unable to feed itself at the moment. And people are starting to realize, actually, wow, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense at a time when we've got this kind of systemic vulnerability in the system. We ought to become food sovereign. We need to be producing a lot more food in our country. We need to be producing a lot more food really close to where we live. And that's just becoming obvious to people now. It's becoming obvious to people also, obviously, in relation to medical supplies. People are thinking, does it really make sense to depend upon China or whoever for giving us all of our personal protective equipment? Of course it doesn't make sense, given these kind of vulnerabilities and contingencies. So people are starting to get the idea that we need a buffer, that we need to be safer, that we need to be precautionary in our thinking. It's for all of these kinds of quite concrete reasons that we now have this opportunity to have a really kind of exciting process of local, national, international debate and to potentially reset in such a more intelligent and, if I could use the word, human way.
Yeah, absolutely. Human and ecological. It's about life. It's about returning to life, and it's about recognizing also that the path away from life is very linked to mega technological systems and to subsidizing every business to use energy and technology instead of employing people. Now that needs to be urgently re-examined and selectively changed in so many livelihoods, from education to healthcare to farming to building. Allowing more people in the equation and less technology creates much more enjoyable and actually much more sustainable and resource conserving paths forward. So I really, yeah, we feel so encouraged also by the fact that there are these demonstrations around the world, that you can actually produce more food if you diversify instead of doing monoculture, that you can actually be far more effective in your use of resources, you know, everything from water to wood, to every aspect of the living world, if you go in this direction of employing more people and more eyes, more hearts, more hands in the equation. For instance, in fishing, you know, now the norm is to have these giant trawler nets that can fit about 18 jumbo jets in them. They just lift everything that lives out of the sea and then throw away half of it, again, dead. I mean, it's just unbelievably inefficient and wasteful. And yet most people are so far away from the impact on the living world. Talk about our arms being so long, we can't see what our hands are doing. When we start localizing, we start seeing the impact, it's not a guarantee for perfect use, but it's a prerequisite for being humble enough and intelligent enough to recognize the complexity of the living world, to recognize also the individualism of every plant, everything that lives, including every human on whom you depend. But now we should have some questions, shouldn't we?
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah.
Okay, so feel free to add any questions. We had a couple responses come in that I thought you might find interesting. Carolina said, in Lisbon area in Portugal, organic farms that deliver weekly to people's homes are at full capacity, and probably the majority of new clients will not go back to the supermarket greens after trying their organic products. So that's a positive side effect. And we also had...
May I just have a quick comment on that? Let's also make sure that we don't get into the thinking of sort of everything's wonderful, and that there are some problematic dimensions to what's been going on in the last several weeks. So one is that firms like Amazon have suddenly become enormously more powerful and profitable. Another is that a lot of supermarkets have been taking on a lot more staff and doing a lot of business. And a lot of people have been thinking of the supermarkets as their lifeline. I think we've got a big job to do, actually, to try to get people to start to shift their sort of the urgency of their minds from the supermarket to community supported agriculture and organic box schemes and local and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, part of this is, again, the bigger picture. So we get away from this well-funded propaganda, which has been funded by corporate-funded think tanks that again and again comes out with studies that argue that we reduce emissions by buying food from the other side of the world. There's just recently a new study that came out that said, oh no, they studied around the world and they found that no, it wouldn't be possible for countries to become more self-reliant in food. Not possible. Only 20% of the food could come from close to home. Why? Because we are blind to the political nature of what we decide to subsidize, what we tax, what we regulate, what laws determine economic activity. We are blind to that because fundamentally both left and right have been funding the same direction. And it's been a fundamentally unecological path and fundamentally a path that leads to unemployment. So that's, yeah. So we have to be aware of that, we can push for policy change as well as supporting local initiatives.
That's totally right and totally necessary, Helena. But also there's a dietary dimension here. A lot of those studies assume, for example, that we will insist on continuing to eat, say, the same amount of tomatoes that we currently do. Of course, what we should actually be doing in a country like the UK is eating rather less tomatoes and eating rather more of the things that actually grow well here in the UK. And when you start to eat more of the things that grow well in your local area and in your country and so on, then you are obviously going to be less dependent upon the supposed need to be bringing in those goods from foreign countries where they're produced in greenhouses and so forth.
But there also it's extremely important that people are aware that countries are routinely importing and exporting the same product.
Absolutely, the great food
tomatoes out, tomatoes in, milk out, milk in. US exports 1 billion tons of beef, and turns around and imports 1 billion tons of beef. Supermarkets fly things across the world to be peeled and washed and processed and thrown back again, but in ever larger quantities. It's what we call insane trade. Now, if we stop doing that, it would be the most effective way of almost overnight reducing CO2 emissions and the need for plastic and refrigeration overnight. And yet we haven't heard enough about that in the climate movement. So this is a very important part of the bigger picture.
Yep.
Okay, I'm just going to jump back to the questions. I'm just going to say if anybody who's put a question in the chat box or has one would like to join the discussion, and you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask the question that way. If not, I'll continue to read some. So I'll read a few whilst some of you raise your hands. We have Imelda. Hi, Imelda from York here. In the UK, as elsewhere, schools are closed. There is a real risk that young children will adopt anxiety about returning to the old normal when they reopen. Have you got a view about how education can change to present the current situation as an opportunity to do things differently through the mainstream education system?
Well, I'd love to make a start on that one because I'm fascinated by this sentence that Imelda has written. There is a real risk that young children will adopt anxiety about returning to the old normal when schools reopen. My response to that is good. It would be good if people were not very happy about returning to their old normal, because there is a lot that is problematic about our normal education system. Helena is a brilliant thinker on this. She can go into this in more detail. It's very problematic to be educating children as much as we do so that we segregate them entirely by age rather than having them help to educate each other. It's very problematic that it's all focused around schools. And I want to mention Ivan Illich's still very pertinent book here, Deschooling Society, which is a great read on this topic. Also, there's a more specific point, but very important point. It's problematic that so much education still takes place inside, in classrooms. This is changing a bit, but it needs to change more. Children should be out a lot more in nature. They should be out a lot more in places where food is grown, and so on and so forth. So it would be great if we didn't return to the old normal. And if, again, we started to try to use this opportunity as a moment to reset, including resetting the education system. Helena, I'd love you to expand on that, especially I think it'd be great to say to people something about this point about the problem of age segregation.
Yeah, well, having lived for a long time, as some of you may know, in this remote ancient Tibetan culture of Ladakh, and from the mid-70s when I arrived there, I was able to live in and speak the language fluently of an ancient culture, deeply adapted to the land, community-based, human scale, and they were basically self-reliant in the region. There was some trade and there was some global trade, but that was in luxuries like jewelry and gold and silver for all the basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, everything they needed was in the region. And then I learned to speak the language fluently, lived with them, and I discovered how in a multitude of systemic ways, the dominant economic system in the name of growth and progress destroyed both the self-respect and the self-reliance. One of the tools, one of the instruments was Western style schooling. And I saw for the first time in thousands of years, children were segregated into separate age groups. And I realized that when you put, the most dramatic example is when you put 30 one-year-old children in the same room all day and one adult trying to manage them, you created elbows. They cannot help each other. So you're just getting elbows and screaming. When you have what every traditional culture had, constant interaction and interdependence, you know, from 1 to 5 to 8 to 80, what you saw was just constant teaching and collaboration. The 5-year-old, even the 3-year-old would reach out a hand and help the 1-year-old to walk. The 1-year-old would look up with admiration to the 3-year-old. The 1-year-old would never think, oh, what's wrong with me? I can't walk as well as my 3-year-old neighbor. Wouldn't occur to them. There's too much to say about it, but there's a lot to say about it, what it means psychologically and what it means really how education has fundamentally been a part of creating a universe of competition and fear instead of collaboration. And it's structural, it's not about values. And this is, again, where our perspective that we bring in is quite different from most Western-based organizations. Because basically what we're seeing is that in the West, starting with psychology, for instance, most of the great thinkers never studied healthy society. They never studied a society where there was no depression and there was no suicide. They didn't study either, you know, a culture where education was fundamentally linked to an ecological path, of deep, intimate knowledge about the resources on which you depend. So we obviously can't change everything overnight, but I do feel that with our lenses, which are these sort of big picture lenses, the sort of paradigm lens, what we are very grateful for is having identified very clear signs that throughout the world, people are not only wanting change, but are implementing change. So there is always this countercurrent. There's a micro trend where even in the West today, education is being changed because so many parents, even many teachers, are recognizing that the mainstream path is very destructive. So you have all kinds of alternatives being brought in. You have alternative schools as well, of course, Steiner and others, Montessori. But the big picture can really help us to see a much faster, clearer path through economic change and policy change to support the sort of education that we all need. You know, we all know that our children need, and I'm absolutely convinced that most people would want if they could see the link between that healthier, more collaborative, more holistic education and real job opportunities for a meaningful livelihood in an economic direction that not only makes sense, but as Rupert was saying, is essential. We really have little choice but to dive deeply into this, you know, total commitment to changing the direction.
Yeah, I mean, one way I like to sum that point up is to say the future will be more local. It will either be more local because we make the kind of changes we're talking about here and use this opportunity to do so, or it'll be more local because society will collapse. And when societies collapse, they become more local by force.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to switch over to, we've got Marilyn has raised a hand. So Marilyn, you should now be able, I can see.
I think you can speak, Marilyn.
Very good, thank you. Hello, Helena. It's a long time since we saw each other. And as usual, it's lovely to see you and hear you. I was thinking about reading also that excellent PDF that Rupert forwarded to us. What engages me very much is the question of corruption. If we could very loosely call it that, that is the fact that all of the kinds of businesses and so on that we would like to see dwindle in importance are very much allied with politics, with politicians, with the people who make the decisions on our behalf. And what are the mechanisms to unlock those ties so that those politicians who really want to do a good job, and I'm sure there are a lot of them, are enabled to do that without feeling as though they're rocking a very, very delicate boat. And I was thinking about the thesis of David Corton a long time ago, actually, that the way forward is through a lot of cooperatives. He used partly the example of Mondragon in Spain. So what I'm after is, I mean, obviously I agree you guys are just saying marvelous stuff. And what are the little mechanisms that can help us to unlock this localized future? And do you believe that cooperatives are one way forward? And if so, what do we need? What would it take to get that moving faster? It is moving, I agree, lots happening already. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. I remember you from Stockholm, right?
And Istanbul.
And Istanbul,
We-
yeah, I would say that I think there's an unfortunate assumption that in order for a business to be more accountable and less corrupt, that it needs to be a cooperative. And I do think that Mondragon and many co-ops actually became too big, because the co-op of the past that I believe we need to change, but generally the co-op of the past tended to be a group of producers linking together in order to compete in the big bad global economy, which is rigged, which is corrupt. It's completely corrupt. It's favoring those that use more energy. It's favoring those that don't pay tax. It's favoring those that are not accountable. So again, we need to understand this global weight, which does create huge corruption, because when our people that we elect, who talk to us while they're being elected, once in power, they're listening to the money coming from this global casino and these big, heavy corporations and all their lobbyists. And one of the biggest forms of lobbying is through the media that basically determines the agenda, determines the voting even. So co-ops, either producers or consumers that just try to come together to compete in the big game, have a very hard time actually doing what is best for nature and for people. So really the key has to do with scale. And then within the local regional economy, even within the national arena, you might well have private businesses, privately owned, but of a scale that is accountable and visible, and in a system that is now, as we're demonstrating them, this system comes about through a collaboration between the consumer, so-called, and the producer, between the farmer and maybe the middleman. Middlemen are not always terrible. It's not about just getting rid of middlemen. The middleman can be a shop that is a local shop that buys primarily from local farmers and sells to the local community. Now, with that chain of visible human scale interactions, you can have the accountability that is a prerequisite for, for healthy and uncorrupt business. Also, the co-op, of course, can be quite a good institution, but I talk about the co-op of the future as being, above all, that cooperation between production and consumption that creates now, we have managed to help create this new cooperation through awareness building, education, where the buyer is very committed to supporting those local businesses that they can see are doing the right thing in terms of the environment and in terms of how they treat their staff. So that, for me, is the sort of new direction, the systemic shift towards structures that at the moment, without policy change, are actually beginning to demonstrate a multitude of smaller things. And then the key is also, we want to encourage everyone to support those local initiatives, to help to start them, but to also join a chorus of voices that demand policy change. And we're talking about demanding a political shift. We're talking about, as XR said, demanding that we be at the table. Civic society needs to be at the table. The representatives of those organizations that have a track record defending people's rights and the environment need to be at the table. And so we're talking about a very profound shift in creating the democratic process that could and must lead to real change.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. I want to bring in another question here, which is bringing up the same kind of issue of scale. So this is in the chat, it's Richard in North Yorkshire. In The Age of Consent, George Monbiot argued that everything had been globalized except democracy and put a case for a world parliament with nation states represented on a per capita basis to avoid bias in favor of rich and powerful countries as with current situation at UN. Thoughts, question mark. So let me make a start on this here. I noticed something where Helena and I disagree slightly, because my view is that I don't really have an objection to George's proposal. I think she does. The key point, though, for me, is that what George gets completely wrong, and here Helena and I completely agree, is that it's a complete sort of failure of vision to say, because everything has been globalized except democracy, we should try to democratize globalization and leave it at that. My view is, yeah, sure, by all means have a go at trying to democratize globalization. But the most important thing to do is to put economic globalization into reverse. And over to you, Helena.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rupert. I mean, I have had debates with George about this also in the Ecologist magazine, where he was vehemently opposed to localization. I know he's changed because he's starting now to talk about community building and so on. But and in fact, you know, a lot of people on the left were very skeptical about localization because they thought of it as some kind of narrow, selfish isolation, and of course the media has pretended that, you know, Trump is some kind of localist, which of course is completely, it's the opposite of the truth. He's a very, you know, he's a clever businessman and well, anyway, I won't go into all that. But my experience is, having lived in America and having grown up in Sweden and been actively involved at the grassroots in many different countries, for us, well, for those of us in Scandinavia who've also experienced America, we very much would worry about creating units that are bigger and bigger, and we don't see any hope of any sort of meaningful democracy on the scale of the globe. I mean, just think what it means. It means that people can't use their own language to lobby their political representatives. I mean, are we really talking about, I mean, the idea that this could function when we already see how badly, you know, this functions in a place like America or, you know, China, Russia. We need decentralization of real power, which is, you cannot gain real political power if you don't also gain more economic power and control. And so we see the absolute need to subsume economic activity under genuinely democratic process. And we believe that in the long run, even in places like America and certainly in Russia and China, that once you devolve economic power, that there would be much more political power at the local level. So it could lead to a sort of a breakup of nations, but in a healthy way, because all the time, what we want to build up globally is collaboration from the grassroots up. So we want to have representation into the global arena, but not to decide what kind of water system we're going to have in, you know, in a village in Bhutan versus a town in America. You know, it's just, you know, to centralize so many decisions that need to be closely adapted to the specifics of place would be absolutely crazy. And to impose from the top. I mean, we've already seen the madness of, in the EU, regulations that were telling all the farmers of Europe when the crop should be in the autumn. You're talking about villages up in the Alps versus villages in, you know, southern Italy. Crazy, madness. You know, so from, you know, some people in pinstripe suits in Brussels starting to make regulations, it's been a disaster. I mean, those regulations have basically fed into huge support for the giant monopolies. So, yeah, no, we want decentralization.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting to look at the way that the federal USA and also the EU have come under pressure during this coronavirus crisis. Both institutions, the EU and the USA federal government, have proven to be, well, less effective than in the US, the states, and in the EU, the nation states, which in many cases have done various things to protect themselves when the EU was failing them. So yeah, I mean, I think that's again going to be something that people learn from this new crisis that we've got, that it's unwise to rely on institutions which are too huge and too remote.
I think there's a question that links in nicely with what you were just talking about, Helena and Rupert. So Georgia has said, one of the challenges that we have with local action here is that local authorities don't have certain powers. So initiatives get blocked. And even if they do have the powers for some things, the councils are dominated by conservative white men, usually retired and over 60, very little diversity, very low levels of interest in making any changes to the system. Also, we're reliant locally on the national and international system. So these things have to change at the same level. We can't just change from the local, or at least it looks really difficult from here.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what we're very clear about, is that there is quite a lot of amazing work going on at the local level. And I'm just so amazed at how much people have managed to achieve since these regulations imposed by local councils, as you said, that are often blindly adhering to very destructive rules and following the orders from above. And in many cases, even when you have very enlightened so-called progressive councils, they're hampered by the fact that they have very little funding, and they're more and more starved of funding, and that they are not allowed to take a lot of decisions. And so, you know, typically now when there's some big, huge development, you know, you want some giant development or a new superhighway, the local council has no say. The state or the national government intervenes and gives the go-ahead. So again, it's about that awareness that if we step back and take a breath and look at the bigger picture, we will see that amazing, really such a large number of initiatives that have been made despite this. And that's why we also want people to look at that more globally, because it's very heartening to realize how much, you know, just from virtually led by women with very little money, very little support, no support from the media, no support from government, and yet from the bottom up, because we want and we see the need for those more human scale, real interdependence of institutions and community building, better care of the earth. So multitude of things happening in every area you want to mention, from education, as we talked about, to healthcare, to architecture, to theology, to psychology. You will find the word eco or alternative put in front of it, as people struggle to go in a direction that is genuinely meaningful, genuinely supporting deeper health, both of humans and ecosystems, that are awakened also to the profound spiritual dimension. In other words, that sense of feeling ourselves connected to the whole, to the sacredness of life, to the magic and the beauty and the mystery of life. So this, again, requires that rebuilding from the bottom up. That's happening. But we're saying we can simultaneously both connect to those initiatives, support them, or start new ones. And when I say we are very clear that we would urge people to do it as a group. We're trying to say, take a breath, take a pause, step back, and try to identify a few people who might want to go on this journey with you. The journey being, let's examine what is the root cause of all these crises we're facing, and is this business about localization meaningful? We are saying there's a magic wand, which is about deep spiritual, psychological, social, and ecological healing. It's a systemic, structural path that is like magic. So you may not believe that, I can totally understand that, but do examine it. And then as a group, as you read more, looked at films, looked at other arguments, and looked around to see the examples, think about whether jointly you might either join or support or start something. Then the other thing is, then please just give some time to getting the message out that we have this fork in the road. That is, on the one hand, more and more competition, further and further from the earth, like literally, the great heroes of this path are talking about going to Mars for resources to explore and exploit, because they've been trashing the earth, and the whole imagery, the whole vision is this constant new frontiers, and it's all linked to competition, getting there first, it's linked to the war machine, very hyper-masculine. Yeah. On the other direction, in the other direction, is the more feminine, the more inclusive, the awakening to the deep wisdom of indigenous culture, and paying attention to the deeper psychological and soul side of things. So please help to get that vision out, that message out. We believe that once there's a real wake up, that both the social and ecological problems on the one side and solutions on the other are linked. So the message isn't just climate and only climate. The message is, we are talking about climate, cruelty to animals, ecocide, toxic monoculture, and we're talking about more meaningful livelihoods, smaller gap between rich and poor, more genuine democracy, more healing, slowing down in our economic lives. We don't have to be running so fast. We have an opportunity to actually slow down and scale down. Where is all this speed coming from? It's a choice as a society. It's not imposed on us from some kind of God up there. Why are we running so fast? Why don't we have time to look after ourselves, after our children, after our parents? Why? It's a choice. It's a political choice. So I'm talking too much, but I hope.
But that was great, Helena. No, I want to say three things in response to that. Firstly, what you just said there about the holistic nature of the crisis and of the solutions to it, Helena. It's so important, and I think more important than ever in the wake of the coronavirus, because we're going to be facing very challenging economic situations for people around most of the world in the coming months and possibly years. If a movement like Extinction Rebellion, for example, makes it sound as if at this point all we're interested in is climate and ecology, we'll be completely missing the point and missing the boat, because what people are interested in is climate and ecology and stopping pandemics and their own livelihoods and having a better flourishing life and health, and on something which joins all of these together, which is why we need to be having systemic, holistic solutions, why we need to be thinking big picture, why we need to be thinking about and implementing a just transition, why we need to be relocalizing. So it has to be, as bold and ambitious and holistic as that, or it's not going to work. Second point I'd like to make, the very fascinating things you were saying there about spirituality and so on, Helena, I very much agree with. And I'm going to take a second to advertise another talk I'm giving next month on eco-spirituality, an Earth talk at Dartington, except of course it won't be at Dartington, it will be by Zoom. And that's on May the 13th, if anyone wants to come. I'm putting right now in the chat the link to that if you want to go analyze more this aspect of what we've just been talking about. And thirdly, I want to pick up what you said a few minutes ago, Helena, about the need to, which the questioner in the chat was also asking about, the need to get serious about having more local power. And I want to think about that for a moment from the perspective of where I'm sitting, which is the United Kingdom, which as many of you will know, and I know a lot of you on the call are from the UK, a very centralized country. And again, in this coronavirus crisis, we're seeing the very inefficacious way in which our national government here works, and the dire need to have more strong local government. And I want to say to people who are in the UK who are on this call, now is a really vital time to stand up and say, we need decentralization in a country like this one. We need more local political and economic power. We need to rebuild differently out of this. The way that the central government has failed us on this pandemic should be a cue towards actually strengthening local governments, which in some cases have been doing better. And there is a really important task coming up as we start to move out of lockdown. There will be an absolutely vital task of contact tracing locally, testing and contact tracing. And we need to be pushing for local authorities and volunteers and mutual aid groups, as well as doctors, to all be involved with that. And if we could start to have some of that happening, I was speaking yesterday to a source of mine very close to the government. If some of that started to happen at the local level, it could really shake up the dynamic, and I think shame national governments which have failed, like our one, on this issue. So that's a concrete way in which right now I think we could start to make the case for the importance, the necessity of greater local power.
Are there any other hands raised, Laura, or not?
Not at the moment, but we can say if anybody would like to jump in, they can. Or if not, whilst doing that, I'll head back to the chat box and ask a few questions. So one, Rupert, that I thought would be very relevant for you actually is, and it might be a good question to summarize everything, is all these small changes that we're seeing at the local level and that Helena described so well are definitely happening and in the right direction. But is this happening fast enough to bring about the environmental changes that are needed to counter the terrifying speed of climate change?
Yes, okay. Well, the simple answer to that question is no. And that's what needs to change. This moment that we're in now, this moment of reset, where we will either kind of try to flip back to the old normal or build a new normal or try to create something radically different and transformative, and that's what it needs to be, is a moment where what we need to be saying is, yeah, look, these kind of changes that we're seeing right now, for example, the massive drop in pollution that we're seeing due to the COVID crisis, that needs to be sort of made permanent and more in a way which works alongside flourishing and doesn't involve people being prisoners in their own homes and so forth, right? What we need to be doing is, and some of the other questions in the chat have been asking this, how do we act on this now politically and so on? What we need to be doing is using every channel that we can use. Right now, digital activism is one. Also, we need to be preparing ourselves. We need to be using this time to be ready to a vital moment is going to be where the powers that be try to reset back to the old normal and try to restart the old growth economy. We need to be ready at that moment with plans, with demonstrations, with movements, with alternative institutions, and so on. And that moment, well, it's going to be coming in different places at different times. We need to be building right now to be ready for that. Look, let me level with you. I think that the overwhelming likelihood is that we are going to see collapses around the world in the coming 10 to 20 years. But I think we have a chance now, because of this crisis, to do the stuff that many of us on this call have known we need to do for years, so that we can rapidly speed up the changes that we're trying to be part of, and to deal with, as you rightly say, the questioner rightly says, the terrifying speed of dangerous climate change.
I think also that we're being told that people don't learn from information, that actually we have not been given the information we need. So it's not that people don't learn from that. So there's actually a huge amount of work to be done to get the word out, to get the holistic picture out. That's what I'm calling big picture activism, that could spread like wildfire. I mean, you know, information, consciousness of how these crises are linked and how the solution is linked. So there's this solution multiplier part that if we just manage to implement a few of the structural benefits by just shifting a bit of the taxation, subsidies, and regulations to favor genuinely productive and healthy work and healthier employment, we would see a really rapid change. I mean, I love to recommend this film, The Biggest Little Farm, which shows how in just 7 years they managed to turn, you know, dead monoculture into this thriving, productive farm by focusing on diversification, not just regenerating soil with carbon, which is a favorite word from the corporate lobby, but actually regenerating the soil, absolutely important. Regenerating the soil, important, but as a part of a holistic transition where the fundamental focus was on diversification. So that, you know, people don't realize how brainwashed we've been into the assumption that on this crowded planet, you know, how are we going to feed ourselves? We can't feed ourselves. We can't, you know, we see the scarcity as emanating from a natural situation of too many people on a crowded planet. No, we have too many people. Our ecosystems would be healthier with fewer people, but the biggest problem by far is that all of those people are being led into a path where they use more and more resources and they don't even see it because it's via giant institutions and bureaucracies where the link to what, you know, what my clothes consist of, where they were made, usually on 3 continents, where, you know, the food comes from, everything we use is being used more wastefully and with using more energy, more minerals, and depending on more and more mining. So it's the ignorance of the system that is the problem, and the wake up to that could happen quickly if we focus more on really educating ourselves and others. And as I say, it's not just about educating ourselves about the theory of the benefit of diversifying and localizing. And by the way, the diversification is a general economic path. We want a diversity of businesses to create that self-reliance, to provide for most of the things we need on a regular basis. And we have examples that demonstrate the benefits, that show the increased productivity, the increased benefits of more community, that show the increased benefits of more meaningful livelihoods. And yeah, anyway, so I hope the combination of the paradigm, the theory, linked to the examples could be a very, very seductive and inspirational wake up. So this sort of wake up could happen very quickly. And then you would have a sort of people power like we've never seen before. We've never, ever had a movement that was addressing everybody's need. You see, there's literally in the corporate world, if you're the CEO of Exxon, as somebody was at some point, the merger with Mobil meant that suddenly there was one CEO instead of 2. So everybody's running scared down this competitive path, which has been created going way back in history and blindly supported. And that competition creates this insecurity and fear. It's a fear-driven path. So I believe that it's possible that we will see a major wake up, but as Rupert says, it's probable that we're going to have more major crises, and that we'll probably, it might take a little longer till we get the big wake up to really shift things systemically, but I hope it won't take too long. I wanted to remind people at this point to please join and support our World Localization Day on June 21st, because we hope that that will add to a bit of a, almost like an advert for this paradigm and movement that exists. Put it on the map. There are so many people who have never heard of this. They don't know how much is happening around the world. They don't know how much testimony there is to human perseverance, human intelligence, human care. The opposite of the dominant story, which is that we are so greedy, we're so selfish, and we were told, we were informed about climate change, but we were just too selfish. We didn't want to change. It's a completely false narrative. We were never told about industry moving to the other side of the world to use slave labor to produce everything we needed and increasing CO2 emissions massively. We haven't been told that the idea that a country's carbon footprint exists is a joke. Our carbon footprint now in virtually any country would mean we have to go around the entire globe and say, oh, how were those shirts made, those shoes, that carrot, that garlic, those building materials, how much carbon you're transporting. We're not being informed. We're not being informed of the big picture.
Yeah, can I take up that last point, because that's absolutely directly related to the essential project of Extinction Rebellion. So Extinction Rebellion's first demand is tell the truth. And we've seen some success on that score since we started making that demand a couple of years ago. Now we've had all these climate emergency declarations, for example, and we've seen some improvement in the media. For example, in the BBC, we've seen some improvement. You know, the media haven't been telling the truth about the kind of things that Helena has been talking about in the last few minutes. You know, they just haven't been. And until we get a lot more truth-telling from the media and a lot more truth-telling from the governments and a lot more truth-telling also, I would say, in some parts of the education system, then it's just not fair to, as Helena says, it's not fair to blame people for not being well enough informed. So I'd say this demand to tell the truth and make sure that people get really well informed is so crucial. And again, I think we've got an opportunity now because people have got some time, some people, to look into stuff now, and also people are concerned and woken up by what suddenly happened, this supposed black swan event, which actually isn't a black swan event of this pandemic. So I think there's a real opportunity on this front now.
Oh, Rupert, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really,
it's been a great pleasure.
Tonight, my time.
Yeah, this morning. I like doing things in the morning.
Yeah. Really.
Yeah, it's been really good, and I've really appreciated what people have been saying in the chat. It's obviously a fantastic audience we've got here. I'm sorry, obviously we haven't got to some questions, but I hope the links and stuff that I've been putting in have been helpful in response to some of them.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you too, Laura, for doing a great job and for putting things into the chat box as well.
I just want to remind everyone that they don't need to worry about copying all the links if they don't have time now, because they'll be sent a list of everything that was in the chat box. So you'll all get that in your email shortly.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody, and do stay in touch, and wonderful global community out there.
Yeah. So Helena, it's lovely to see you there. I'm so sorry I won't be seeing you in Devon next month as I usually do, I suppose. Are you staying in Australia for the foreseeable future?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
It's a great relief not to feel compelled to travel. We're actually really looking forward to doing a lot of our international conferences by bringing in our sort of global picture through the web, and then having local people bring in the local and regional voices on the ground. So I think, so this World Localization Day on June 21st will be one example of that kind of thing. Because we see this huge need for more real information from the ground across the world. Yes. We don't get it in the media, we don't get it in academia. So the truth that shows that human beings are actually a lot more generous and kind and compassionate and intelligent.
Well, again, I think that's one of the things which is really coming out of this coronavirus crisis. All these mutual aid groups, and in this country and in some other countries, the support for the health service and people looking after each other just informally on the street. When I go for my daily jog, we have a daily exercise we're allowed to take here in the UK. I find that people are really very thoughtful about maintaining a 2-meter distance, and everybody's kind of looking at each other and kind of smiling in a way which didn't happen so much before.
That's right. That's
People
right.
notoriously very reserved. There's a little bit more kind of, actually, ironically, there's people talk about social distancing, and I say, no, that's the wrong term. It's physical distancing.
Exactly.
Socially, I believe we're actually getting closer.
Yeah. And I've heard many people say that they now have much longer telephone conversations with friends and colleagues. And there's been, like you said, it's not all good, but there are, above all, let's look for and be aware of the way the dominant narrative is constantly demonizing human nature. It's the fundamental cornerstone of modern economic thinking. And so it's been there for a long time and it's reinforced all the time. No, the new story is actually to embrace who we are and to listen to our deeper needs. And that's what's happening on the ground.
Absolutely. And I just want to say finally, thanks to everyone for all the lovely things you've been saying in the chat box. It's really, really nice and heartening to read. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'll end the meeting now.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.